out to me that I'd been saying it Proust, but it is in fact Proust. So, if you're talking about the book to anyone, it's myself, Proust, not Proust. Despite all the admiration Monsieur Swann professed for these figures of Giotto, for a long time I took no pleasure in contemplating in our schoolroom where the copies he had brought back to me had been hung. This charity without charity, this envy which looked nothing more like a plate in a medical book illustrating the compression of the glottis or uvula by a tumor of the tongue, or by the introduction of the operating surgeon's instrument, a justice whose greyish and meanly regular face was the very same which, in Combray, characterized certain pretty, pious, unfeeling bourgeois ladies I saw at Mass, some of whom had long since enrolled in the reserve militia of injustice. But later I understood that the startling strangeness, the special beauty of these frescoes was due to the large place which the symbol occupied in them, and the fact that it was represented not as a symbol, since the thought symbolized was not expressed, but as real, as actually experienced or physically handled, gave something more literal and more precise to the meaning of the work, something more concrete and more striking to the lesson it taught. In the case of the poor kitchen maid, too, wasn't one's attention constantly brought back to her belly by the weight that pulled on it? And in the same way, also, the thoughts of the dying are quite often turned towards the aspect of death that is real, painful, dark, visceral, towards the underside of death, which is in fact the side it presents to them so harshly, makes them feel, and which more closely resembles a crushing burden, a difficulty breathing, a need to drink, that we call the idea of death. There must have been a good deal of reality in those virtues and vices of Padua, since they seemed to me as alive as the pregnant servant, and since she herself did not appear to me much less allegorical, and perhaps this, at least apparent non-participation of a person's soul in the virtue that is acting through her, has also beyond it aesthetic value, a reality that is, if not psychological, at least, as they say, psycho-physiognomical. When later I had occasion to meet in the course of my life, in convents for instance, truly saintly embodiments of practical charity, they generally had the cheerful, positive, indifferent, and brusque air of a busy surgeon, the sort of face in which one can read no commiseration, no pity in the presence of human suffering, no fear of offending it, the sort which is the ungentle face, the antipathetic and sublime face of true goodness. While the kitchen maid, involuntarily causing Francois's superiority to shine forth, just as error by contrast renders more dazzling the triumph of truth, served coffee with according to Mamma, who was merely hot water, and then took up our room's hot water, which was barely lukewarm. I had laid down on my bed, a book in my hand, in my room, which tremulously protected its frail, transparent coolness from the afternoon sun behind its nearly closed shutters, through which a gleam of daylight had nonetheless contrived to pass its yellow wings, remaining motionless between the wood and the window pane in a corner, like a poised butterfly. It was barely light enough to read, and the sensation of the splendid brightness of the day came to me only from the blows struck in the Rue de la Cour by Camus, told by Francois that my aunt was not resting and that one could make noise. against some dusty crates, which, however reverberating in the sonorous atmosphere peculiar to hot weather, seemed to send scarlet stars flying into the distance, and also by the houseflies that performed for me in a little concert, a sort of chamber music of summer. This music does not evoke summer in the same way as a melody of human music, which, when you happen to hear it during the warm season, afterward reminds you of it. It is connected to the summer by a more necessary bond, born of these fine days, born again only with them, containing a little of their essence. It not only awakens their image in our memory, it guarantees their return, their presence, actual, ambient, immediately accessible. The dim coolness of my room was to the full sun of the street what a shadow is to a ray of light. That is to say, it was just as luminous and offered my imagination the full spectacle of summer, which my senses, had I been out walking, could have enjoyed only piecemeal. And so it was quite in harmony with my repose, which, because of the stirring adventures narrated in my books, sustained, like the repose of an unmoving hand in the midst of a stream of water, the shock and animation of a torrent of activity. But my grandmother, even in the hot weather, had turned bad. If a storm or merely a squall had risen, would come up and beg me to go out, and, not wanting to stop my reading, I would go and continue it in the garden, at least under the chestnut tree in the little hooded chair of wicker and canvas, in the depths of which I would sit and think I was hidden from the eyes of the people who might come and pay a visit to my parents. And wasn't my mind also like another crib in the depths of which I felt I remained ensconced, even in order to watch what was happening outside? When I saw an external object, my awareness that I was seeing it would remain between me and it, lining it with a thin spiritual border that prevented me from ever directly touching its substance. It would volatilize in some way before I could make contact with it, just as an incandescent body brought near a wet object never touches its moisture, but is always preceded by a zone of evaporation. And this sort of screen, dappled with different states of mind, which my consciousness would simultaneously unfold while I read, and which ranged from the aspirations hidden deepest within me to the completely exterior vision of the horizon which I had at the bottom of the garden before my eyes. What was first in me, innermost, the constantly moving handle that controlled the rest, was my belief in the philosophical richness and the beauty of the book I was reading, and my desire to appropriate them for myself, whatever that book might be. For even if I had bought it in Cambrai, having seen it in the front of Borange's grocery, which was too far away from the house for Francois to be able to do her shopping there as she did at Hamos's, but which was better stocked as stationer and bookshop, held in place by some strings in the mosaic of pamphlets and monthly serials that covered the two panels of the store, which was itself more mysterious, more sown with ideas than the door of the cathedral. The fact that I had recognized it as having been mentioned to me as a remarkable work by the teacher or friend who appeared to me at that period to hold the secret of the truth and beauty half-sensed, half-incomprehensible, the knowledge of which has the goal, vague but permanent, of my thoughts. After this central belief, which moved incessantly during my reading from inside to outside toward the discovery of truth, came the emotions aroused in me by the action in which I was taking part, for those afternoons contained more dramatic events than does often an entire lifetime. These were the events taking place in the books I was reading. It is true that the people affected by them were not real, as Francois said, but all the feelings we are made to experience by the joy or the misfortune of a real person are produced in us only through the intermediary of an image, of that joy or that misfortune. The ingenuousness of the first novelist consisted in understanding that in the apparatus of our emotions, the image being only an essential element, the simplification would consist in purely and simply abolishing real people would be a decisive improvement. A real human being, however profoundly we sympathize with him, is in part perceived by our senses, that is to say, remains opaque to us, presents a dead weight which our sensibility cannot lift. If a calamity should strike him, it is only in a small part of the total notion we have of him that we will be able to be moved by this. Even more, it is only a part of the total notion he has of himself that he will be able to be moved himself. The novelist's happy discovery was to have the idea of replacing these parts impenetrable to the soul by an equal quantity of immaterial parts, that is to say, parts which our soul can assimilate. What does it matter thenceforth if the actions and the emotions of this new order of creatures seem to us true, since we have made them ours? Since it is within us that they occur, that they hold within their control as we feverishly turn the pages of the book, the rapidity of our breathing and the intensity of our gaze. And once the novelist has put us in this state, in which, as in all purely internal states, every emotion is multiplied tenfold, in which this book will disturb us, as might a dream, but a dream more lucid than those we have while sleeping, and whose memory will last longer, then see how he provokes in us, within 1 hour, all possible happiness and all possible unhappiness, just a few of which we would spend years of our lives coming to know, and the most intense of which would never be revealed to us because of the slowness with which they occur, preventing us from perceiving them. Thus our heart changes in life, and it is the worst pain. But we know it only through reading, through our imagination. In reality, it changes as certain natural phenomena occur, slowly enough so that if we are able to observe successively each of its different states, in return we are spared the actual sensation of change. Already less interior to my body than these lives of the characters, next came, half projected in front of me, the landscape in which the action unfolded, and which exerted on my thoughts a much greater influence than the other. The one I had before my eyes when I lifted them from the book. It was thus that during 2 summers, in the heat of the garden at Cambrai, I felt, because of the book I was reading then, homesick from mountainous and fluvial country, where I would see many sawmills, and where, in the depths of the clear water, pieces of wood rotted under tufts of watercress. Not far off, climbing along low walls, were clusters of violet and reddish flowers. And since the dream of a woman who would love me was always present in my mind during those summers, that dream was impregnated with the coolness of the running waters, and whichever woman I conjured up, clusters of violet and reddish flowers would rise immediately on either side of her like complementary colors. This was not only because of an image of which we dream remains forever stamped, is adorned and enriched by the glimmer of the colors not its own, that may happen to surround it in our daydream. For the landscapes in the book I read were for me not merely landscapes, more vividly pertained my imagination than those which Cambrai had set before my eyes, but otherwise analogous, because the author had chosen them, because of the faith with which my mind went to meet his word as though it were a revelation. They seemed to be an impression hardly ever given me by the countryside in which I happened to be, and especially by our garden, the unmagical product of the perfectly correct conception of the gardener, so despised by my grandmother, an actual part of nature itself, worthy to be studied and explored. If my parents had allowed me when I was reading a book to go and visit the region it described, I would have believed I was taking an invaluable step forward in the conquest of truth. For even if we have not the sensation of being always surrounded by our own soul, it is not as though by a motionless prison. Rather, we are in some sense borne along with it in a perpetual leap to go beyond it, to reach the outside with a sort of discouragement as we hear around us always that same resonance, which is not an echo from outside, but the resounding of an internal vibration. We try to rediscover in things now precious because of it, the glimmer that our soul projected on them. We are disappointed to find they seem to lack in nature the charm they derived in our thoughts from the proximity of certain ideas. At times we convert all the forces of that soul into cunning, into magnificence, in order to have an effect on people who are outside us, as we are all well aware, and whom we will never reach. Thus, if I always imagined the woman I loved surrounded by the places I longed for the most at that time, if I would have liked her to be the one who took me to visit them, who opened the way for me into an unknown world, it was not because of a simple chance association of thoughts, no, it was because my dreams of travel and of love were only moments, which I am separating artificially today, as if I were cutting sections at different heights of an apparently motionless, iridescent jet of water, in a single inflexible upsurge of all the forces of my life. Lastly, continuing to trace from the inside to the outside these states simultaneously juxtaposed in my consciousness, and before reaching the real horizon that enveloped them, I find pleasures of another kind, the pleasure of being comfortably seated, of smelling the good scent of the air, of not being disturbed by a visit, and when an hour rang in the bell tower of St. Hilaire, of seeing fall piece by piece what was already consumed of the afternoon, until I heard the last stroke, which allowed me to add up the total, and after which the long silence that followed it seemed to commence in the blue sky, that whole part that was still granted for me, reading until the good dinner which Francois was preparing, and which would restore me from the hardships I had incurred during the reading of the book in pursuit of its hero. And at each hour it would seem to me only a few moments since the preceding hour had rung. The most recent would come and inscribe itself close to the others in the sky, and I would not be able to believe that 60 minutes were held in that little blue arc comprised between their two marks of gold. Sometimes even this premature hour would ring 2 strokes more than the last. There was therefore one I had not heard. Something that had not taken place for me. The interest of the reading, as magical as a deep sleep, had deceived my hallucinated ears and erased the golden bell from the azure surface of silence. Lovely Sunday afternoons under the chestnut tree in the garden at Combray, carefully emptied by me of the ordinary incidents of my own existence, which I had replaced by a life of foreign adventures and foreign aspirations in the heart of a country washed by running waters. You still evoke that life for me when I think of you, and you contain in it from having gradually encircled and enclosed it. You still evoke that life for me when I think of you, and you contain it, in fact, from having gradually encircled and enclosed it, while I went on with my reading in the falling heat of the day, in the crystalline succession, slowly changing and spanned by leafy branches, of your silence, sonorous redolence in limpid hours. Sometimes I would be drawn from my reading in the middle of the afternoon by the gardener's daughter, who would run like a lunatic, overturning an orange tree in its tub as she went by, cutting a finger, breaking a tooth, and shouting, they're coming, so Francois and I should run out too and not miss any of the show. This was on the days when the regiment passed through Combray on its way to garrison maneuvers, generally going down the Rue Saint Hildegard. While our servants, sitting in a row on chairs outside the railings, gazed at the people of Cambrai taking their Sunday walk and allowed themselves to be gazed at in return, the gardener's daughters, through a slit left between two distant houses in the Avenue de la Gare, and had caught sight of the glitter of helmets. The servants had rushed to bring in their chairs, for when the cuirassiers paraded down the Rue Saint Hildegard, they filled in its entire breadth, and the cantering horses grazed the houses, covering pavements submerged like banks that offered too narrow a bed for a torrent unleashed. "Poor child," said Francois, having barely reached the railings and already in tears. "Poor boys. To be mowed down like grass in a meadow, the very thought of it gives me a shock," she added, putting her hand on her heart, where she had received that shock. "A fine sight, isn't it, Madame Francois? All these youngsters with no care in their lives," said the gardener, trying to get a rise out of her. He had not spoken in vain. "No one cares for their lives. No cares for their lives." "Well now, what should we care for if we don't care for our lives, the only gift the dear Lord ever gives us twice over? Alas, dear God, it's quite true, though, they don't care. I saw them in '70. In those wretched wars, they've no fear of death left in them. They're nothing more nor less than madmen, and they're not worth the rope to hang them with. They're not men anymore, they're lions." For Francois, the comparison of a man to a lion, which she pronounced lion, was not at all complimentary. The Rue Saint Hildegard turned too sharply for us to be able to see anything coming from far off, and it was through that slit between the two houses in the Avenue de la Gare that we saw more and more new helmets flowing and shining in the sun. The gardener wanted to know if there were many more still to come, and he was thirsty because the sun was beating down. So all of a sudden his daughter, leaping out through a place besieged, would sally forth again from the corner of the street, and, after braving death 100 times, come back to us bringing along with a carafe of licorice water that news that there were at least 1,000 of them coming without a break from the direction of Thisbersey and Messaglise. Francois and the gardener reconciled would discuss what action should be taken in case of war. "You see, Francois," said the gardener, "revolution would be better, because when they declare a revolution, it's only them that wants to that goes." "Well now, at least I understand that. It's more honest." The gardener believed that when war was declared, they would stop all the railway trains. "Of course, so he doesn't run off." And the gardener, oh, they're clever ones, because he would not admit that war was not a kind of bad trick that the state tried to play on people, and that if only they had the means to do it, there would not be a single person who would not have to run away from it. So I'm going to end today at page 91.